Hello, in this screencast we'll look at events in ActionScript. It's intended as a very simple overview with a couple of examples. Events are responses to actions, so an action, the user does something, okay, or Flash itself does something, generates an event. Anything that the user does or anything that happens within Flash generates an event. And actually this is true of all graphic user interface applications. It's true on a web browser, it's true when you use Word. Whatever you do or something that the application itself does generates an event. So example events, and actually there are lots of different events, I mean scores of them, are things like a mouse click or something called an enter frame, which I'll go into more detail in a little while, or when a timer starts, or when a file loads, or there are any number of things. And what we do with regards to events, if we're interested in them, is that we have to create an event listener. So in order to create an event listener, we have to write some code to add a listener. What is a listener? It's a function which requires parameters. Two of these parameters are compulsory. We have to tell it which event we want to listen for, and we have to tell it what function to call. This is a function that we will write. What function to call when the particular event we're listening to happens. So let's look at this function, which is called addEventListener, in a kind of overview. So if we want to listen to an event, we write addEventListener, and then we have to tell it the event that we're interested in and the function that we want to write in response to that event. So in other words, in the example here, the event is the name of the function to listen for, and then your function is the name of some function that you will or have already written that will deal with those events. So let's look at an example. Here's an example of how to add a listener for a mouse click. So we have addEventListener, then the event we're listening for, in this case mouseEvent.click, and then the code, the function, the code that we'll write that will listen to that, which I've called handleClick. So in this example, mouseEvent.click is the event that we're listening for, and handleClick is a function that we'll write to specify the action that will be in response to that particular event. So when the user clicks, handleClick will be the code that we'll do. Now, the other example I want to give you is about enter frame, which we use a lot for animation. And to understand that, we need to understand how Flash thinks of movies. Flash uses the analogy of a movie for its animations. And as in a movie, each movie is composed of frames, each frame being a single action. It's the analogy of a reel of film where each frame of the film constitutes a single still image. Well, this is each frame within a Flash movie is a single action. And by default, each frame fires 24 times a second. We can alter that, it's known as the frame rate, and we can change it to be faster or slower. And Flash has a particular event, the enter frame event, which it fires 24 times a second. And we use this to animate inside Flash. So let's look at the addEventListener for frames. This is how we would add an event listener for the frame event. So addEventListener, exactly as the same as when we were listening to mouse events, but instead of mouseEvent.click, it's now event.enterFrame. So here, the event.enterFrame is the event I'm listening for. And in this particular example, because I'm going to use it, or it's often used for animation, the function I'm going to write, or that I've already written, I've called animate. Obviously, the function. You can call anything you want that makes sense to you in terms of what you're doing. So in this example, animate is the function that you would write that will be called in response to that event. So let's look at how we respond to an event. You write a function that's going to respond to the event, and that function must have a parameter that's the same type, the same data type, as the event you're listening for. So for instance, if we were listening for a mouse click, and I've written a function called handle click, then the parameter inside this function, which I've happened to call EV, is going to be a mouse event, because that was the event we were listening for, mouse event.click. If we were animating and listening to the frame event, the function that I'd write is called animate, and it's going to accept a parameter which again I've called EV. We can call it anything you want, but EV reminded me it was an event and it was short to write, and its data type is event, because when I used addEventListener, if you remember, it was event.enterFrame. Now, in these function definitions, as always, you have to return a value, so I've said it's returning the data type void, and then just to remind you, as with any function, you open brace, and then you would have the code inside. Obviously the code would normally be on the next line. I've just compressed it and represented it by the 3 dots, the ellipsis. So EV, to recap, is the parameter, and of course you can call it anything you want, it's just a variable. When we call addEventListener, you normally attach that event listener to an object. So here in this example, I'm using addEventListener and attaching it to an object. So in this particular example, I'm calling addEventListener, attaching it to a button object which I've called myButton. So myButton.addEventListener means I've attached the event listener to an object that I've called myButton. So if there was this thing called myButton on the stage and someone clicked it, I've written it so that it adds the mouse event click to that button, and it will call the code called handle click, the kind of code we've called before. Now, if you don't attach an object, in other words, if you say just add event listener, then by default it adds the event listener to the object in which you have written the code add event listener. So if you're inside your main function, for instance, which is inside your main class, and you just write add event listener, then what it does is it adds that event listener to the main class, in other words, this inside your code. Now that becomes significant when we start to look at enterFrame, because often when you're using enterFrame, you don't bother adding it to anything specific, you just call addEventListener. So that's a very quick overview of how addEventListener works, and then hopefully when you start the next bit of work and you look at the next screencast, it will make more sense because you'll have some sort of overview of how event listeners work. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.